Welcome. This is an update to the status of Solar Cycle 25 for May of 2024. Now, we've had a lot of activity in the last month or so. This reminds me very much of the previous solar maxima that I've observed before, in that there's been a lot more flares, there have been bigger flares, and lots more sunspots and bigger and longer lasting sunspots. As I said in the title here, now this is much more like solar maximum. That doesn't mean that solar maximum is here. We may have some time yet before we actually reach the full level of solar activity. So let's see what's going on now and be able to compare it to what we will see in the coming months. A quick summary of what we're going to talk about. May of 2024 was the most active month for over 20 years. It had new highs in sunspot number for Solar Cycle 25. It had flares and coronal mass ejections galore, 234 C flares, 121 M flares, and 21 X flares, and 215 CMEs. The outstanding number here is the number of M flares and the number of X flares. That's quite remarkable numbers. We also had 7 geomagnetic storms, including a G5 storm, which is classified as an extreme geomagnetic storm. Now here's an old favorite that I've shown many times before, and this is the sunspot data from Solar Influences Data Center in Belgium. We have yellow here are the daily sunspot numbers, in blue we have the monthly average sunspot numbers, and in red we have what's called the smooth sunspot number, and that's the most important one, and we'll get back to more detail on that later. The blue arrow shows where the minimum is between Solar Cycle 24 and Solar Cycle 25. You'll note that the daily sunspot number is much higher than the previous cycle, the peak there in this last month. The monthly average is again higher than anything else in Solar Cycle 25 or Solar Cycle 24. And we'll get to more detail about the smooth sunspot number. But it has reached a new high, which means the earliest date we classify as solar maximum will now be November of 2023. And if we get higher numbers in the coming months, it will move steadily later. Well, I said we'd get into more detail of the smooth sunspot number, and here's a plot of it over the last 2 cycles. The peak of Solar Cycle 24 lasted about 3 years and peaked in April of 2014. We don't know yet how long Solar Cycle 25 maximum will be, but if it was 3 years, we've still got quite a way to go. And you can see the most recent point, which is November of 2023, is the highest point in the smooth sunspot number in any of this time period. In fact, you can go all the way back to 2002 to find an equivalent number for the smooth sunspot number. So let's take a look at an actual video of the sunspots for this last month of May. The data is going to be from the Solar Dynamics Observatory HMI instrument. We're going to be using its optical channel, which images photosphere at about 5700 degrees Kelvin. The things to note here are the size of the sunspots, particularly those that are larger than the Earth, the number of sunspots and the number of regions which contribute to the overall sunspot number, and most importantly is the dynamics of each region, how the sunspots appear, disappear, spin or move with respect to one another. And that is the thing that drives the amount of activity we see in terms of the number of flares. The most dynamic regions will be the ones that flare most. The ones that are emerging quickly or dying quickly will produce big flares as well. Sorry, this is a bit of a busy figure, but I tried to get all the information in one go. This is a comparison of the flares that we've seen so far in solar cycle 25, that's in orange, compared with the number of flares we saw throughout solar cycle 24 in blue. We'll start with the C flares, top left hand corner, and you can see the C flares are running about a factor of 2 higher than the equivalent time period with respect to solar minimum from solar cycle 24, and already, even after just 40% of the solar cycle having gone by, we're already at 84% of the number of C flares we saw during solar cycle 24, which totaled 7,811. And so we've got another 7 years to go to fill in that last bit. So certainly solar cycle 25 will vastly exceed solar cycle 24 in terms of C flares. The same is true of the M flares, that's top right. That's running nearly a factor of 3 higher than solar cycle 24 at the same time. And we're already overtaken the total number of flares for solar cycle 24, which was 738 last month. And so we're actually running about 17% ahead of that value already. So again, we're going to vastly outnumber the number of flares from solar cycle 24. Even more impressive are the X flares, bottom left. They're running at nearly a factor of 3 higher than the previous cycle, solar cycle 24. The total number of X flares we saw in solar cycle 24 was 49. We're already 6% above that in solar cycle 25. And of course, in the remaining 7 years, it will get even higher again. Lastly, coronal mass ejections, well, they're a fish of a different color. They are running at about 49% ahead of what the previous cycle was at the same stage. So it's not quite so impressive as the flares. But even so, after just 39% of the cycle gone by, we're at 54% of the total number of CMEs that was seen during solar cycle 24, which was just over 10,000. So now let's take a look at those flares. These are the flares for May of 2024. These are data from the Solar Dynamics Observatory AIA instrument. And we're going to use the 131 angstrom channel. That's the flaring corona with a temperature of about 10 million degrees. Here again to note the locations of the flares with respect to the sunspot regions, the bright regions, their brightness. Of course, the brighter the thing you see on here, the bigger the flare was, and their duration, particularly whether they were impulsive little flashes or they were long duration events. Impulsive flares imply growth in the region. Long duration events imply coronal mass ejections, major rearrangements of the coronal fields. To stress how much activity there has been, I plotted the last 7 days of the X-ray emissions from the GOES spacecraft. And you can see we've had several X flares, vast numbers of M flares, and almost uncountable numbers of C flares. So this has been a very busy time, and as I say, this reminds me very much of the sort of activity we saw during previous maxima, which was absent from solar cycle 24. So next we're going to take a look at the coronal mass ejections. The data from this comes from the SOHO, LASCO and Solar Dynamics Observatory. The LASCO C2 is the high resolution imaging of the inner corona, and the SDO AIA 304 channel is a transition region channel that shows material at about 50,000 degrees Kelvin. The things to note here are the speed of the CMEs, their location, east or west. East is fairly benign for us. West can actually imply that we could get a geomagnetic storm from it. And also note for proton impacts. When we have a major flare, sometimes they emit protons, and that shows up as a sort of a snow on the image for a day or two. As a result of all this activity, we've had several space weather impacts on Earth. First of all, the solar wind. We've had some high-speed streams that have hit the Earth. Those have caused geomagnetic storms. We've had aurora to unusually low latitudes, particularly on the major event that we had in the middle of May. And we've had a total of 7 geomagnetic storms in May, which is an unusually high number. And associated with major flares, we also get radio blackouts of various parts of the Earth that are sun-facing at the time of the flare. Here is the famous geomagnetic storm that occurred from the 10th to the 12th of May, which was a G5 event, the highest category, which is an extreme event. And you can see that the KP index plotted here reached its highest level of 9 several times. Now, there was a lot of fuss made about the big geomagnetic storm, and in case you missed it, I have a nice video of the storm seen from some northern latitudes. When a big flare goes off, we generally get radio blackouts because the sun emits radio frequencies all across the radio spectrum. And if you're on the daylight side of the Earth, then those frequencies will be drowned out by the sun. In this particular case, we had frequencies below 10 megahertz drowned out for most of North and South America and parts of Western Europe and Western Africa. Some people are making a big fuss about how weak the Earth's magnetic field is and the heliosphere, and how cosmic rays are getting into the Earth in much greater numbers than before. This actually plainly isn't true. Here is the cosmic ray flux, and you can see that solar cycle 25 has reached a value of about -7%. That means there are less cosmic rays hitting the Earth than solar cycle 24. So it says that the heliosphere is stronger than it was during the last cycle. It's approximately equal to solar cycles 23 and 20. It's a little bit less than solar cycle 21, but probably will get there in the end. And a lot less than solar cycle 22, which is one of the record-breaking lows that we've ever had. So we will have I'll have to take a look at this and see what happens in the future. But at the moment, the heliosphere looks fairly fine. It's returned to what it was more normally. And so all this worrying about the heliosphere's magnetic field weakening is, in fact, nonsense. We had several surprises in the month of May. Several comets crashed into the sun, and if you looked at my X channel, you'll see videos of them. I'll show you the best example on the 21st of May. 3 repeats. We also had a Venus and Jupiter conjunction near the Sun, and of course that's not unexpected. That can be predicted many centuries in advance, but nonetheless it was nice to see it. 3 repeats. Last, but by no means least, you want to take a look at the total solar irradiance, and that's the amount of energy arriving at the top of the Earth's atmosphere from the Sun. And you can see in red here solar cycle 25, and it's much higher than solar cycle 24. And so we're getting more energy from the Sun, which means the Sun is more active. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Solar cycle 25 will peak in November of 2023 or later, much probably later. High levels of solar activity show that solar cycle 25 is still growing, still very active. There's no sign of it decaying as yet. The heliosphere's magnetic field, originating from the Sun, has returned to typical values. So thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and goodbye.